Joe walks into that office and say, motherfucker, hey, my number one receiver, you're not going to let both of them go in the same offseason. Is the Cincinnati Bengals, who have called themselves the forgotten contender, and if in case you're forgetting why they're the forgotten contender, hey, you aren't subscribed, you ain't like, follow, comment, what are you doing? Hit the notification button, hit subscribe, get with the program, so everything can be fun, everything can be copacetic. Why you gotta be so difficult? All right, back to the episode. In 2023, the Cincinnati Bengals went 9-8, despite Joe Burrow only playing 10 games, most of which with let's just say 1.5 legs, because they never were completely sure and confirmed what actually happened to his calf that entire time. Jake Browning came in and is going to be someone's starter in the future because he made him a bunch of money. And they just barely missed the playoffs and got their offense coordinator a job. So that leads us to this year. And we'll start with question 1. Dave, what's more likely for the Cincinnati Bengals? That they make the Super Bowl or they miss the playoffs altogether?
I think it is miss the playoffs.
Ooh.
Because I think that I think the thing with the Bengals is, and I've been real big on this the last couple of weeks, couple of months, and maybe this is part of like the coaching background coming into a little bit of it, but I look at locker room situations a lot, and I just have to think there's going to be some carryover with Cincinnati with Jamar Chase's contract dispute, T. Higgins' contract dispute. And we're not getting to the root of the issue, which is I still don't think they've addressed the offensive line in Cincinnati the way that they need to, because at the end of the day, that's what's kept them back, has been the offensive line not being able to keep Joe Burrow on the field. So with not having, to me, adequately address the offensive line, the defense hasn't gotten better, particularly this offseason. If anything, it stayed the same, and it wasn't like we talk about the Raven defense or the Cowboy defense or the Bears defense like we saw at the end of the year that was pretty dominant. Like it's a middle of the pack defense, and Joe Burrow here of late, the injuries have piled up. He's missed a lot of time. I think it's realistic to say they're closer to not making the playoffs than they are winning the Super Bowl. And I've talked about this on the opening kickoff podcast I do. I've talked about this on the Ed Block Courage cast I do with all the people around the league that I've talked to, is that there's going to be a good team that doesn't make it in the AFC. And I think it's going to be a team out of this division. And I think it's Cincinnati.
This is the hardest team I've ever had to make this decision for, because I think at best we're talking about the 4th best team in the conference. Kansas City obviously being one. I think Houston's in there. A team in this division we will get to last is in that spot. And then it's between the Bengals and Buffalo, just because they got their recent receiver issue somewhere in there. And since there's a team in this division that's better than them, it's more likely they miss the playoffs, because if you're not going to win your division, that leaves the wild card a chance. And now we got tiebreakers and you need this many division wins and blah, 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 blah. But then when I try to think, okay, if they're not a wild card team, who are the 3 teams that are, assuming we get 17 games out of Joe Burrow, which we'll get to shortly, that's where the struggle came. That's where I found myself trying to talk myself into more teams than not. It's like, all right, do I trust in Aaron Rodgers to make it 17 games at age 40 off an Achilles over Joe Burrow at this point? Probably not. Do I trust targetless Justin Herbert and Jim Harbaugh's first year to make it over the Bengals? Also probably not. The point I want to focus on, though, that you brought up was the locker room situation between Jamar Chase's contracts and T. Higgins' contracts. Now, we're recording this Monday before this comes out. And there's a chance that by the time y'all hear this, Jamar Chase has re-signed and he's fully on the board. And because CeeDee Lamb signed, an hour before we hit record on this?
Yes.
So there's a chance that he is re-signed. But in the event that he has not, if his quarterback was anyone else, but his college bestie, I'd agree with you. If it was anyone other than Joe Burrow who would be able to pull him to the side and be like, bro, I got you. They're going to take care of you. Let's just get through the year. See, Higgins, I think he's gone. I think that's pretty much established at this point. There's no turning back on that one. But I kind of want to hear what you say on that point. Does that quarterback receiver relationship, does that play any role in the way you interpret this?
To me, it's a very small extent, because the reality is we're talking about this is professionals. And at the end of the day, what's every professional's goal, KP? To make money.
Get paid.
So as much as you and I can be buddies, if we're both offensive linemen and you're a tackle and I'm a guard and I see you get $20+ million and I know I figure to be somewhere in the $15 and $16 million range per year, but I know that team probably isn't going to pay me because they just paid you, I'm like, that's gonna cause some friction. It's natural, because as a society, we get jealous of things. So that's the sort of thing where I'm like, okay, you have two receivers that both want to get paid. Joe Burrow got paid, I believe.
Yes, he did. Recently. He was the highest paid quarterback for like 2 weeks before Jalen Hurts got paid.
Exactly. So, like, Joe Burrow's got his money. Would it be nice for him to say, yeah, sign my boy Jamar? Absolutely. But, like, Joe Burrow will be fine. He's got his money. Jamar Chase is sitting there going, wait, I didn't get my money. You're already telling T he ain't getting his money. Like, there's going to be friction. It's the nature of this being a business on top of being sport.
The pushback I have to give on that, though, it's a couple places. One, Joe Burrow got them to draft Jamar Chase. So who else other than Joe Burrow are they giving a big contract right now? If they're going to give another big contract, it better be to the guy that I convinced y'all to draft, who's been awesome for us from the moment he stepped on the field.
I apologize to cut you off, but you brought up something that I don't think that I should have mentioned that needs to be factored in here. Think about the team and the ownership group that we are talking about.
Yes.
This is the Cincinnati Bengals. This is the Brown family, which is known to be
cheap. Just say it cheap. Just say it cheap.
Historically cheap. And I've heard the horror stories from guys that played in Cincinnati in the early 2000s. Like, to me, that's got to be factored in too, that, hey, the Brown family may have said, we'll pay the quarterback, we'll find a receiver. And that might have been the conversation with Jamar Chase. So that also, to me, factors a little bit into this. Is we're not dealing with, like, an ownership group that's rational, that maybe will try to make an effort. I could see Cincinnati saying, paid our quarterback, we'll make it work elsewhere. We already traded Joe Mixon.
The only saving grace on that, because that's super fair point. For y'all that aren't really familiar with how Mike Brown and the Bengals front office and ownership group gets down, think Donald Sterling minus the racism. If you want to save yourself a Google search, like that level of cheap, like reusing tape, poor practice facilities. They're practicing out of high school at some point. Like, yeah, a lot of craziness going on there. But I don't know, maybe this is me watching too many Disney movies. I just think somehow that relationship between Burrow, that front office, and Jamar, if Joe walks into that office and say, motherfucker, pay my number one receiver, you're not going to let both of them go in the same offseason and have me throwing the Jermaine Burton going into my 5th year into the league and tell me to go win a Super Bowl. That's just not realistic. But when you describe the offensive line situation analogy with us, and we're on that same O-line, you just saw me get paid, and I know I'm not going to get my value. Does that not sound more like the Jamar Chase and T. Higgins situation? I think if there's going to be friction anywhere, it's going to be between them. Well,
and that's my bigger point, is that when there's friction in a locker room, it hangs over everything.
True.
The best way I can describe it is, I think the Philadelphia Eagles have a big conversation, have a big elephant in the room that I hope they've addressed. Because that's the sort of stuff that when you start to get that dissent, you start to have those issues, it doesn't take much for the locker room to get real divided. Even to the guys that may not really care or have a horse in the race, you feel that tension, you feel that friction in a locker room, and it affects the on-the-field play. It really does. And the worst thing possible would be your two top receivers turn into mercenaries. And they're less team first. They're more, hey, I've got to go show now. I've got to go make money, right? Like, I got to have a big year personally so that I get my big payday that I'm not getting here. That's where, okay, you open that can of worms, it's going to hang heavy. I really do believe that in Cincinnati.
And another point to add to that is a point that I don't think people are bringing up enough, and people that are more familiar with the Bengals are going to agree with this. Outside of Burrow, the glue that kind of kept that receiver group together was Tyler Boyd, because he was the OG of the group. He was the adult in the room. He's now in Tennessee with their old offensive coordinator. So you have the glue out the room. You have possible contract tensions between Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. I'm saying I think Jamar Chase is going to get signed before game one. I'd be shocked if he wasn't. And that if my scenario is true, that's going to add to that tension and probably make it worse. But if your scenario is true and neither of them get signed going into the season, they're both going to be pissed. So it's really a lose-lose situation on that part.
Yeah, I don't see this as a good scenario for Cincinnati. It just feels like it's got mess written all over it. I think that they're going to be competitive, but with enough pitfalls on this roster as it is, now you add in drama off the field. It's a really bad recipe. I don't like that sort of hanging over a team going into a season.
I don't love it either, but to move off the offense for a second, one of the things last year that really caught me off guard was Lou Anarumo, the defense coordinator for the Bengals, was getting the ESPN article written on him was, quote, mad scientist, unquote, Lou Anarumo is the man behind the Bengals' stingy defense. That was written by Ben Baby in January 28th of 2023. A year later, the Bengals were 28th in pass defense, 26th in run defense, and 31st in total defense. Bottom of the barrel in the entire league. And with DJ Reader walking out the door, combined with Chidobe Awuzie and all the time they let leave, I can't see that getting any better coming into this year.
No, the defense was on a decline last year. And you bring up the excellent point about that. That cannot be understated. That couples a lot with the offensive line problems for the Bengals. I think the issue for Lou Anarumo is, at the end of the day, if you look at his defense, it's stingy because he can beat you with coverages, but the best way I can describe it is he tries to win the coverage battle and rely on the front four getting home. But the front four gets pressure because your coverage is so good on the back end. You start to chip away at that coverage a little bit. And guys that were proven commodities back there could play well. They did have some injuries in the secondary, so that has to be factored in. That affects your ability as a defensive coordinator to not have to bring pressure, because then when you do bring pressure, now what are you doing? You're putting the secondary guys that you couldn't trust to sit back in coverage one-on-one on an island, but you've got to find a way to generate pressure so the quarterback is not sitting in the pocket for 5-6 seconds, able to pick you apart. That's why they can't beat Kansas City. When we get down to the brass taxes, that's what keeps Cincinnati from beating Kansas City year in and year out. They don't generate pressure on Patrick Mahomes. They let him sit back and look. You give any quarterback in the NFL time, he will find a guy open.
The only counterpoint I'll add to that before we end the Bengals segment is when you look at the top teams in the AFC, who has that number one receiver that you need to take out of a game? Travis Kelce might be the closest, but he's not a receiver. And there is no taking Travis Kelce out of a game. The only top AFC team that has a receiver you have to take out of a game is the Bengals. Is Jamar Chase, who's on their team. Other than that, you don't have to worry about that with the Ravens. Now you don't have to worry about that with the Bills. Texans pending. I don't consider the Dolphins in that top echelon of team with Tyreek Hill. So that's the only place I'll be like, all right, if these pieces can come together, there might be hope, but I don't see it. I think I might have just talked myself out of them being closer to Super Bowl than missing a playoff as this segment went on.
You're welcome.
I think I had to talk myself out of it.
I was trying to lead you down that road.
I think I had to talk myself out of it. All right. So it is Monday, February 10th, 2025, the day after the Super Bowl. Dave, the headline of the Cincinnati Bengals season will be what?
More questions than answer about Zach Taylor's regime in Cincinnati.
So they missed the playoffs. Zach Taylor's out the door.
I don't know if out the door, but I think all of a sudden the seat gets a little hot. Because I think the reality is, as we talked about, so much talent on that team, should be better than they are, but something will hold them back. That's sort of how Cincinnati has been the last couple years. Even when they got to the Super Bowl, was great team, but there's a very obvious problem. And that problem always shows up at the worst possible moment. In the Super Bowl year, it was the offensive line could not block worth a damn.
And then here comes Aaron Donald.
Exactly. Like, maybe the best pass rushing defensive lineman of our generation shows up on the field, and you've got to try to block him for 4 quarters, and you can't. Joe Burrow's health 2 other years has shown up. The defense is, as we've alluded to, bad. Like, there are going to be questions about Zach Taylor. And I don't think it's that he can't be a good head coach, but it's, did the league catch up to Zach Taylor and he never got back ahead of them?